Hi, my name is Andre Gonawala. Welcome back to the Burn Bag Podcast. This week, we're joined by Ambassador Nicholas Burns, the former U.S. ambassador to China and one of America's most seasoned diplomats. We're going to be diving into the state of U.S.-China relations in 2025, what Ambassador Burns saw on the ground in Beijing, and how trade, tech, and diplomacy are shifting under the current administration. I'm very excited to have you, Ambassador Burns. I've been wanting to do this for a long time.
Thanks very much, Andre. I'm pleased to be with you.
So, Ambassador, how would you explain US-China relations to a first grader in the most simplest of terms?
To a first grader, this is
Yeah.
among the most challenging questions I think I've ever received in my public career that dates back to 1980. I guess I'd say to a first grader, I'd want to point to a map and say there are small countries in the world and there are big countries in the world and powerful countries in the world. And here's the United States of America, and here's China. One is slightly larger geographically than the other, but the other is a 5,000-year civilization, and we are 250 years. I'm going beyond probably a first grader. Both these are the most important countries that you, as a first grader, 6 years old, will encounter in your lifetime.
Wow.
How'd I do?
I think you did pretty well. I think you captured it for, a 6-year-old to understand everything. Because I work in this field looking at sort of geopolitical risk as it relates to China, and there are so many complexities. It is such a comprehensive relationship that really transcends so many different sectors, so many different fields. You could be working on national security, you could be working on trade, pharmaceuticals, energy, whatever. US-China relations is going to determine so much of that. So, Ambassador Burns, how would you characterize the current state of US-China relations in late 2025? Have we entered a new phase of permanent strategic rivalry, or is there still room for more consistent, pragmatic engagement?
If I had to choose one word, I'd say it's complicated. This is a complicated, complex, challenging relationship. I do think that the US and China are structural rivals, and that rivalry is going to continue well into the next decade and probably beyond the next decade. We're rivals for military power in the Indo-Pacific. The US has been the established power since September 1945. We're just marking the 80th anniversary of the end of the war in the Pacific. China is contesting, and the growing power of the PLA is contesting that American role as the strongest military power in the Indo-Pacific. We're also obviously competitors on technology, and technology is at the center stage of global politics, but also this relationship. The commercial rivalry in artificial intelligence, in quantum computing, and biotechnology, but the fact that there are going to be military spin-offs that will revolutionize military technology from all those leading edge technologies. The fact that we are competing in a way for global economic and trade positioning and power. You've seen the difficulties that both President Biden and President Trump have had in trying to convince China to play by the rules, whether it's on intellectual property rights violations, forced technology transfer. This is a big issue, considering the fact that China is our third largest trade partner. And finally, and this is not an order of importance, but if you think about military competition, tech competition, economic competition, finally, we have polar opposite views on how society should be structured, on the rights of individuals, on human rights, on press freedoms, on rule of law, on religious freedom, on the right of freedom of the press. And those differences are profound. And I think there's a battle of ideas underway between the Chinese leadership and the American leadership with our Western allies about what kind of world we want to live in. So as I sat in China representing the United States over the last several years, I was profoundly occupied by this competitive nature of the relationship. I think I spent about 80% of my time as ambassador on the competitive edge. And that to me is the fulcrum. It's the center of the relationship between the two countries. And I don't expect much change there. Now, there may be times, and we may be entering one where the American president and the Chinese president are a little bit more conciliatory. There'll be times when the when the relationship is difficult. It was certainly difficult for most of my time as ambassador, but the reality won't change on competition. But two more quick points.
Yeah.
What makes this very complicated and complex to handle is that our strongest adversary, our strongest competitor, China, is also a country with which we have to work. We have to work with China on climate change, on fentanyl, on public health. If there's going to be a next, there certainly will be a next pandemic. The law of averages will dictate that. And so it's not as if we can wall ourselves off from China or they to us. We're going to have to find a way to compete and manage that competition in such a way that we can also combine forces when it's in our interest to work together. And then a final point, we have to live in peace. In the nuclear weapons world, in the cyber world, in the AI world, which is upon us, uh, it would be absolutely catastrophic for our two nations to collide in warfare. And so I always felt, and I think everyone else did on our side in the US-China relationship, that we had to compete, manage that competition, engage when we could, but by all means, we had to keep this away from a conflict. And that makes this one of the most difficult relationships, maybe the most difficult relationship for us to manage on a day-to-day basis. And I certainly felt that responsibility. I know all my colleagues at U.S. Mission China did, and they were spectacular, by the way, my team. We all felt this responsibility.
No, absolutely, and it's such a comprehensive relationship, as I said earlier, as you have just said in your answer. From your vantage point in Beijing, and for our audience, by the way, Ambassador Burns served as ambassador between 2022 and 2025, so he just wrapped up his time in Beijing in January. So my next question is really, from that vantage point in Beijing, how was the Chinese government viewing the return or the prospective return of President Donald Trump in 2024, maybe even before then, right? Because I think right now we're seeing so much of what we traditionally think of as foreign policy standards and guidance being upended. We've seen the trade war, the tariffs, everything.
Yeah.
How was the Chinese government viewing the return of Donald Trump while you were still ambassador?
Well, it's an interesting question because we held a public event in our embassy gym on election day. We were 12 hours ahead of Washington, D.C., so it was the morning of Wednesday, November, I think it was the 5th of November. And as the results came in, it was very clear to me by noon Beijing time, so midnight Washington time, that President Trump had won the election. And I could see from the faces on the Chinese diplomats and business people, officials around me, that they were adjusting to that reality, as was I, as the American ambassador. And, when you're an ambassador for the United States, you want to be bipartisan and you don't want to be political. And I certainly was not political in the
Mhm.
job. So it was my job between election day and inauguration day, and I was there in China for almost all of that time. I left just before President Biden left office and President Trump came in, to talk to the Chinese and listen to them as they talked about how they wanted to work with President Trump. I think they made a very quick adjustment. Of course, the Chinese leadership knows President Trump, knew him from the first term. I think they felt they could work with him in some respects. They were certainly alert to the possibility, given the campaign and the emphasis that candidate Trump had put on tariffs, that they might get into a tariff spitting war with the United States, which of course ultimately happened. So they prepared for that and they began to prepare for it. But they wanted to send, I think, a signal that they would, of course, work with President Trump and his team. They had no alternative but to do so. So I think it was really quite businesslike. But I could see them gearing up on the trade front and thinking of how they could, just in listening to them, how they could respond to a challenge on tariffs by the Trump administration. I think they also felt that President Xi Jinping and President Trump had a fairly cordial and productive relationship, as did President Biden, by the way, when President Trump went
Hmm.
through his first term. And so, the anxiety level may have been higher in other capitals. The Chinese are very pragmatic. They turned to the next person and they prepared to work with him as best as they could.
Absolutely. And I mean, I've heard of the pragmatism by the Chinese government and the Chinese in general quite a bit. And for our audience, Ambassador Burns has served as ambassador to multiple other entities in the past. He's often engaged with our European partners. So, Ambassador Burns, I mean, you've had this decades long career. What was it like engaging with the Chinese government? How did they approach negotiations? How did they approach talks? What were they like
Well,
versus other countries?
that's a really intriguing question because I dealt with the Israelis and Palestinians. I dealt with the old Soviet Union when I was at the White House for President George H.W. Bush. I was ambassador to NATO in 9/11, Iraq and Afghanistan. So, had a variety of experiences in responding and working with countries around the world. I think the Chinese government, the Communist Party of China, was by far the most challenging government with which I ever worked from a couple of perspectives. First is there is an intense competition between both governments, and it's about the power that we talked about in the second question that you asked me, Andre. And so it's a competitive relationship. There's a lot of jousting, there's sparring. I was very impressed by the professionalism and intelligence, English language ability of many of the Chinese officials with whom I worked. Highly educated, highly experienced. I never underestimated them because you shouldn't underestimate a group of people like that. But since they live in an authoritarian environment, since they were party officials, many of them, not just government officials, Communist Party officials, since in a fearful society where the power of the party has risen under President Xi, there is often almost an Alice in Wonderland quality to our discussions. There were times, and not infrequent, when they would simply not tell the truth about a situation. And that might sound naive or not
Okay.
to your listeners, but actually, in most diplomatic conversations with most countries around the world, you try to actually be straightforward about facts and about events. And I did have conversations at some points with Chinese officials. The balloon incident is probably of February
Yeah.
2023, the best example, where they just denied straight to the face the reality of what we clearly saw in front of us. So I wasn't surprised by that. But it was sometimes difficult to deal with them and to actually make any progress because of that inability in a fearful authoritarian environment of them to be straightforward about what had happened. There were other times, however, when they saw it in their interest and I saw it in our interest to try to work together. So climate change was an example of that. We had two excellent American negotiators, first John Kerry and then John Podesta. I'm close to both of them. I worked very closely with them on this issue. And while we didn't agree with everything the Chinese were doing, we had a real problem with the continued construction of coal mines and coal power in the Chinese economy with
Hmm.
the level of both methane and nitrous oxide. I think we shared a sense of responsibility as the two largest carbon emitters, and China's a far larger carbon emitter than we are, to try to work together for the greater good, because in the Chinese government, they do recognize climate science and they do believe that climate change is real. And of course, that was our position in the Biden administration. So there are other times when you really could work. You may know that at the very end of President Biden's term in office, we were able to secure the release of 4 Americans who we felt had been wrongly imprisoned in China. And I had visited 3 of them on 3 separate occasions in their prison cells. And to go into a Chinese prison and to see the reality of what happens to people in those prisons was a really forbidding experience. And when we were able to, with a lot of work and leadership from President Biden and work by a team of us, we were able to secure their freedom. I met the 4 of them at the Beijing Capital Airport, embraced them, gave them their
Hmm.
passports, told them they were free men. They were all men. One of them held for 17 years. One of them held for 12 years, one for
That's a
eight
long
years, one for
time.
4 years. Um, these were individuals who had gone through hell. And to see them reunited with their families for Thanksgiving, because 3 of them were released just on the eve of Thanksgiving, the Chinese were absolutely wrong to hold them because they weren't guilty of the charges that have been brought against them. But we were able to, after 3 years of effort, work on releasing them. There were times when, you could see that pounding away at an issue and not giving up, it sometimes gets results. So it's really a mixed bag in dealing with the government because the rivalry was always there and the sparring was always there. And the battle of ideas between us, they would often in meetings, kind of in an ideological way, tell me they would list the shortcomings in American society and our government, and I would feel compelled to fire back. There were a lot of unpleasant moments, but there were some moments when we did work together. So, I left China in mid-January, just before our inauguration, and I'm still processing in a lot of ways everything that happened and everything went through. I will say one thing. I had a magnificent team
Hmm.
in U.S. Mission China. By U.S. Mission China, I mean our embassy in Beijing, 4 consulates: Shenyang in North China near the Russian and North Korean borders, Wuhan, central China on the Yangtze River, Guangzhou, the manufacturing capital of the world, and Shanghai, of course, the business capital of China. I had an extraordinary team from 48 U.S. government agencies. And I must say, given all the debate we've had in the United States about, what the Trump administration has done to the federal civil service and the foreign service, these are individuals who are entirely non-political. They're career officials, and they had served both Republican and Democratic administrations. I was so proud to work with them. I couldn't achieve anything without that great team in U.S. Mission China.
Yeah, and Ambassador Burns, you have also served under both Democratic and Republican administrations as
That's
well,
right.
just so our audience knows that, for so many of our foreign policy professionals, they are nonpartisan. So I think that is something
Agreed.
important to highlight, especially as we
Yeah.
see, I think, the assault on federal civil service and so on. But Ambassador Burns, if we take a step back now, we look at the strategic landscape, a lot of eyes saw the stark images from just the last weekend, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, the SCO Summit. In China, we saw pictures of Chinese President Xi Jinping, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and of course, Russian President Vladimir Putin, all sort of standing together. People were, I think, alarmed by the pictures of Xi and Modi together. But I think at that summit, Xi emphasized a multipolarity and closer ties with Russia and the global South. Do you believe that Beijing is serious about creating perhaps what some may deem an alternative world order, or is that maybe just a step too far?
I think the Chinese leadership is determined to try to undercut American leadership in the world, determined to try to weaken America's alliances, which is part of our great power in the world in the Indo-Pacific. As you know, Andre, we are treaty allies with Thailand and Japan and South Korea and the Philippines and Australia.
Hmm.
Very strong security ties to New Zealand, to Singapore, and of course to Prime Minister Modi's India. And I think the Chinese, especially in my time as ambassador, when President Biden was so successful in strengthening those Indo-Pacific alliances, the Chinese were very worried about that. They saw that as a power play by the United States, which it was, against their interests, and they're doing everything they can to weaken it. So I do believe that one of the objectives, mid to long term, next 10, 20, 25 years of the Chinese leadership, is to supplant the United States as the strongest country in the Indo-Pacific and to work with authoritarian countries like Russia, like North Korea, Iran, to downgrade the liberal international order that we established 80 years ago at the end of the Second World War. I do think that is the goal of the Chinese leadership. And it was arresting to see after the Shanghai Communication meeting, the September 3rd parade in Beijing on Chang'an Avenue in Tiananmen Square, where President Xi, President Putin, and Kim Jong-un of North Korea stood together. There were a lot of messages there,
Yeah.
and they were clear messages. One was as the PLA soldiers and nuclear weapons and hypersonic weapons and undersea drones paraded through the square, we're powerful now. You can't contest our power. We are a near peer of the United States. I think that was message number one. Message number two was, if you think that you can peel Russia off in a reverse Nixon or Kissinger that some people in the Trump administration, but not President Trump, had talked about, there's no way that's going to happen. Those two 72-year-olds, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, stood together. I think it was their 53rd meeting since President Xi took office as General Secretary and President in 2012. That is a very tight personal as well as bilateral embrace. That was the second message. Third message was, they're not going to help us anymore, Russia and China, in trying to work on penalizing North Korea for becoming illegally, under international law, a nuclear weapons power. I was, as Undersecretary of State for George W. Bush, I worked with the Russians and Chinese, both on the Iran nuclear issue and on the North Korea issue, on the same side of the table.
Mm-hmm.
We sponsored Security Council resolutions, Chapter 7, against both North Korea and Iran, and succeeded in convincing the Security Council to go forward. Those days are long past. With Kim Jong-un on the platform in Tiananmen Square, there's no question that especially Russia, as well as China, have just forgotten about the fact that relatively recently they were opposed to North Korea's nuclear weapons program. And then I think a final message that was well played in the West, the day before the parade, on September 2nd, President Xi and President Putin had a bilateral meeting, and I was really struck by one of the quotes from President Xi Jinping. He said, China and Russia, the Soviet Union, were the main victors in the Pacific War of 1937 to 1945, from the Japanese occupation of Eastern China to the end of the war. And I certainly recognize that both the Soviet Union and China suffered in extraordinarily terrible ways through the entire Second World War, that both of them sacrificed, but so did the United States. We were the major supporter of China. When the Flying Tigers arrived in 1937, American flyers in 38, before Pearl Harbor, after Pearl Harbor, when FDR had 500,000 American troops in China in the second half of 1945, we demobilized the Japanese army after the Japanese surrender. And for them to ignore the efforts that the United States made, that was an ideological statement. It was a revisionist statement in an autocratic kind of way. Let's just, we're going to white out. We're going to just take out of the photograph the fact that Franklin Delano Roosevelt insisted that China be a permanent member of the Security Council, nationalist China, which was so weak, frankly, in 1945. I thought that was a low moment. As an American, I objected to that.
No, absolutely. I mean, a lot of American lives were expent during World War II, not discounting the Soviet and
in
the
the
Chinese
Pacific
lives.
Theater, especially.
But I mean,
That's
so
right.
many, and we still have so many veterans of those battles still with us, the greatest generation. So, Ambassador Burns, you gave me a lot of different, things to consider in that last answer. I want to sort of focus on the military parade, though. I mean, so much of our defense policy is really geared towards preparing for a potential war in the Pacific, potentially against China, potentially, over certain entities, and so on. When you saw that military parade, did the capabilities on display concern you? Was it sort of a shock moment, or was it, these are capabilities we already knew they had, that's old news?
Well, in one sense, democratic countries don't have parades like this.
Yeah.
We don't parade nuclear weapons, ICBMs, through the, down Pennsylvania Avenue or Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C. We just don't do that. That's not been our tradition. Autocratic regimes do it because that's how they define power, the power to intimidate, the power to essentially send a message, don't fool with us. It's much more powerful to hold up the Declaration of Independence. All men and women are created equal, and our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. I think that's the difference in how we talk about power in the world. So I wasn't surprised that that's the kind of parade they have, because that's what they do in an authoritarian. That's what Putin does in Red Square. That's what the Iranians do in the middle of Tehran. And that's what the Chinese Communist Party does. Secondly, no, I think it's well known that the Chinese have achieved capabilities that are quite significant as the PLA engages in the biggest military buildup of any country, and completely non-transparent, by the way, over the last 2 or 3 decades. And I think the back to the United States, or the message that we should take away, is the United States military is strong too. We are becoming peer powers militarily. I would say the United States is still stronger. We have a
Mm.
much more experienced military. We have officers and NCOs experienced in combat. That means a lot. And we're also a very resourceful militarily, where individual initiative is down at the NCO level, and it makes us more flexible as a military. But the Chinese have been completely non-transparent about the buildup of their nuclear weapons forces. They refuse to negotiate or even discuss their nuclear weapons buildup with us, which is a source of great frustration, and it should be for every country in the world. So there was a lot to take in from that parade. And one of the messages I think that I hope Americans will take in is that this is not just a one-to-one battle or kind of posturing or dueling between these two militaries, because the unique advantage we have is that we have allies, military allies, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, very close to China, India as a strategic naval and air power. That's why we shouldn't forsake India or
Yeah.
put 50% tariffs on India. And, it was really interesting as ambassador to see the degree to which the European countries, NATO, were very focused on China. They were objected to Chinese military support for Russia in the Ukraine war. So they were our ally too. And if you try to compare the military power of China versus the American alliance, and if you add Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines to the American side, we are more powerful. And that's why we've got to be alliance minded. And I do criticize the Trump administration on sometimes belittling our allies, Denmark and Canada, treating Japan and South Korea on a tariff sense on a par with China, which is nonsensical to me and to many other people. And if we just pay attention, respect our allies, and work with them, I think we can deter many aspects, not all, but many aspects of Chinese misbehavior militarily in the Indo-Pacific. But if we try to go one-on-one and don't ask the allies to help and denigrate them, it just hurts us. China has 14 neighbors and bad relations with most of them, and really no significant military allies in the world at all. So this is a great American advantage. And all of our presidents until now, until President Trump, have seen this as the difference maker between the US and China. I think that's something that Americans need to reflect about. And that's why we should honor our allies in East Asia and certainly in NATO.
So you mentioned India there. India and China have had some pretty tense relations since 2020. I mean, they've always had somewhat tense relations. Go back to the 1960s and you'll see the war that they fought. But in 2020, they had a border clash that killed tens of soldiers on both sides. Following those clashes, the Indian government put restrictions on Chinese apps. There was a lot of tensions in trade, a lot of tensions in security. But recently, I think since last fall, we've been seeing a thaw occur between the Indian government and the Chinese government. However, while US relations with India have been going up, these 50% tariffs, 25% the reciprocal stuff, and then 25% uh, against India for buying Russian oil. Not that other countries don't buy Russian oil either, but specifically on India, we have
Like China.
50%. Yeah, exactly. Right. But the Chinese
Yeah,
are facing a lower tariff rate than India. India is facing 50%.
it's
Uh,
incongruous.
and then, these images of Modi and Xi, they're meeting, they met, I think, in the fall. That sort of indicates like, okay, like this thaw, it's the ice really is melting. So, I mean, what do you make of relations between Modi and Xi, between India and China? Do you think that they are going to go for some sense of normalization in relations, or do you think there's still a lot that has to be done between India and China? Because I think a lot of generalists will look at Modi and Xi and say, oh, the US is pushing India towards China. Is that an oversimplification?
Well, I do think that the American the Trump administration's mishandling of its relationship with India is the most serious strategic mistake that the Trump team has made in foreign policy. For a generation now, since Bill Clinton's presidency, every American president of both parties has held up as a very high objective the establishment of a strategic partnership, not an alliance, but partnership between India and the United States. I mentioned the fact that I think we've done more air and naval exercises with India in the Bay of Bengal in the Western Pacific than any other country. India's national security interests are focused on trying to limit Chinese expansionism in the subcontinent and in South Asia, as well as the Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal. India has a very serious border conflict with China. The Chinese have disregarded Indian sovereignty, violated Indian sovereignty is a better way to put it, more accurately, along that long Himalayan border. And, they are structural rivals as well. The two largest economies, the two largest societies by population in Asia. India haven't overtaken China in the last few years in population. So every American president has been able to, in essence, encourage a much stronger strategic relationship with India. I was the lead U.S. negotiator way back 2005 or 2008 on the U.S.-India Civil Nuclear Agreement, which was a landmark agreement that really propelled the relationship forward. And for the life of me, I cannot understand the strategic mistake that's been made, how they could make it in the Trump administration. They're putting tariffs on India, and they value the tariff relationship from a negative perspective much more than they do the military and diplomatic alignment that we had achieved with India. And if you think of the Quad, and your listeners might not know what that is, but it's a grouping of the heads of state of India, the United States, Japan, and Australia. These are four countries which together are more powerful than China. And we have been aligning together, meeting together, not to go to war with China, but to limit China. And now I think because of the mistakes of President Trump and his administration, we have driven Modi away from us. And for the first time in 7 years, Prime Minister Modi went to China. You saw the photographs with President Xi and with President Xi and President Putin. That's not a photograph that we should want to see. And so I really hope there'll be a change of heart and strategic direction in Washington, and the administration will recognize just how much damage they've done to our critical first order priority, limit the power and the expansion of Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. India is key to that.
No, absolutely. I mean, I've been a staunch proponent of, U.S.-India relations, and I mean, so much work has been done, and it's sort of scary to see all of it potentially being squandered right now. I mean, the tariff negotiations, the U.S. and India are very much dicey, but I mean, we'll see what happens. But speaking of tariffs, I mean, we have this sweeping reciprocal tariff regime. Of course, we have these legal battles that are taking place about them, but right now they are in place. We are currently negotiating with China during this current 90-day truce. Things seem all right, it seems, but I mean, how do you assess the current state of US-China trade negotiations, and what should the US actually be trying to achieve with these negotiations?
I actually think that President Trump has been right to be tough-minded in the use of tariffs against China. There's been a remarkable symmetry between the last two American administrations. President Biden implemented all of President Trump's tariffs against China, and President Biden raised tariffs in May 2024, 100% on Chinese electric vehicles, 50% on Chinese semiconductors, 25% on Chinese lithium batteries into the United States. And so I think there's been a combined effort, bipartisan, to try to address the real problem that China represents in trade in the world, whether it's intellectual property, forced technology transfer, an absolute refusal in many cases by the government of China to play by the normal rules of trade. So I don't think, you can get the attention of the Chinese by being soft. And I think President Trump has been right, maybe not to lift tariffs to 145%, which is where they were at the end of April and May, but to be tough and to be serious and to pressure the Chinese into being more reasonable about its treatment of American companies. So that's first point. Second point, I do think it's in the interest of both governments to have a trade agreement. President Trump's been very clear he'd like one. President Xi Jinping has as well. These are very tough to work out. You've seen the Chinese withhold for 30 days the export of rare earth minerals to the United States. You've seen the United States withhold airplane spare parts, computer parts. So there's kind of been a real duel about this. But my gut sense tells me that Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, will be successful in his negotiations with Vice Premier Hurley Fung. And I don't think, Andre, we're going to see President Trump and President Xi meet until there's a trade agreement. The Chinese style in summitry is not to have the leaders work out or hash out, or negotiate for 2 days differences. They will want to see a deal made, and they'll want to have the two presidents bless the deal at a
Yeah.
meeting. And I hope it'll happen because China is our third largest trade partner. American companies need more relief from Chinese pressure. I'll give you one example. China has been historically in recent decades the largest market for American farmers and ranchers in our fishing industry. The Chinese are playing hardball. They've not made a single contract on soybeans in 2025. As recently as 2023, when I was ambassador, the United States, sold $14 billion worth of soybeans in 1 year.
That's
It was
huge.
by far our largest product. And if you're from Illinois or Indiana or Iowa, just to pick three of our farm states, soybeans are critical to the local economy. So, and President Trump has recognized this, and he says he wants to help American farmers. So I think if there's a deal, China's going to have to give and compromise and make some big commitments to purchase American agricultural products. And of course, it's diplomacy, it's trade. We're going to have to make some compromises too. I do think it's in the best interest of both countries to get there.
So there's been a lot of focus on tech restrictions, for example, export controls on semiconductors or on AI tools. Do you think that tech restrictions would become a formal part of a future trade agreement between the United States and China? If so, how would that change the nature of economic competition and the tech race and the AI race?
I think it's a slippery slope for the US, and I'm not saying that President Trump intends to do this, but to answer your question, to make tech restrictions a fundamental part of a trade agreement, because I don't think we should be compromising on tech restrictions. And I'll put it this way. Lenin, and I have to tell sometimes my younger students, I don't mean John Lennon, but Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, that Lenin, he said infamously, the capitalists will sell us the rope from which we hang them. And that was actually our theory of the case 3 years ago this autumn, when the Biden administration announced that we would prohibit the export of advanced semiconductors for AI purposes. We don't want that technology to get to the PLA, which it certainly would. We don't want to give the PLA a leg up in competing with the United States Navy and Air Force in the Pacific. From a technology standpoint, we wanted to deny that. Now, we didn't have any expectation that we could that the Chinese wouldn't innovate, but we thought we could delay them by several years. And in fact, I think we have done that. You now see Huawei trying to innovate around the American restrictions, but I don't think we should give that up. I did not favor President Trump's decision to allow NVIDIA to export the H-20 chip to China, and it really rebounded against us. It was a unilateral offer by President Trump. He didn't get anything for it from the Chinese. Maybe he just felt it would be goodwill. But then the Chinese turned around and prohibited their companies from buying the H-20 chip. And because I think he made the argument, it's a Trojan horse, it's dangerous. So I think we should be extremely reluctant to back down from our contention that our most sensitive dual-use technology should not be exported by American companies to China. There's something more important than the fortunes of any one of our individual corporations. And that's the basic national security of the United States, and China's our strongest adversary. So I would hold the line there. I hope President Trump will hold the line there.
Yeah, you don't want to give the adversary the tools with which they can win. So,
Exactly.
I mean, building on that, I mean, when we're talking about specific types of export controls or outbound investment screening, what types of those do you believe are necessary or counterproductive when dealing with China's own tech ecosystem?
Our theory of the case in the Biden administration, and I think it's probably similar, by the way, in the Trump administration. And I want to obviously credit the Trump administration when they are doing things with which I agree. I think I have to do that. I
Hmm.
think both administrations have felt we don't want to shut down the trade relationship between these two countries. As recently as a year ago, it was $642 billion in trade, two-way trade in goods and services between the US and China. That made China our third largest trade partner. So it's really important for the American economy. Upwards of 1 million American jobs depend on trade with China. A lot of our companies are successful because they trade with China. So I think both President Trump and President Biden have said and have acted that we want to keep the trade relationship going. But there's a narrow band of technologies that have real implications for our national security. And we called it small yard, high fence in the Biden administration. We ought not to be selling our most sensitive technologies that the intelligence community in China or the military could take advantage of. And we tried to keep that band of technologies narrow. We didn't want to expand it across the whole economy. That's a tricky thing to do. But I think we succeeded in doing that in the Biden administration. And I hope very much that President Trump will stay in that same lane that we were in because that's in our best interest.
So, I mean, we have China continuing to push for tech self-reliance while they're also courting so many global South partners. I mean, for example, on the electric vehicle front, you see BYD, the Chinese EV manufacturer, popping up all over the global South, for example. They have mills and manufacturing firms in Pakistan and, Southeast Asia and so on. We also see China controlling sort of key critical mineral supply chains in Southeast Asia as well. I mean, they're and we also have the Belt and Road Initiative in the background as well. So, I mean, how should the United States actually adapt its economic diplomacy to counter, China's broader approach with the global South?
Well, first and foremost, I think there's 2 points here, Andre. First, we felt strongly in the Biden administration, Secretary Janet Yellen specifically, our Secretary of the Treasury, that China was engaged in dumping its excess manufactured products on the rest of the world. So the examples that she gave publicly when she came to China in the spring of 2024 were that on solar panels, on lithium batteries, on electric vehicles, on steel and robotics, 5 categories. The Chinese were manufacturing 2 to 3 times domestic demand, so what they could sell in China, and dumping at artificially low prices those products on foreign markets. And we went through a China shock here at the beginning of the 20th century, 20 odd years ago, where the Chinese did the same thing, and they knocked out they killed a lot of American jobs, and they left a lot of empty storefronts in a lot of our towns, small towns and cities. And President Biden was determined, as I think President Trump is, we cannot afford a second China shock. So Secretary Yellen, and I was with her in all these meetings, she warned the Chinese leadership, if you continue to do this, we're going to have to raise tariffs against you, which is exactly what President Biden did about 6 weeks later after this visit. But what's really interesting, it wasn't just the United States raising tariffs. India raised tariffs on China. Turkey did. South Africa, a close friend of China, raised tariffs against China. Brazil did. Colombia did. Mexico, Canada, the United States of America, and the European Union. There has been a universal condemnation of this very self-centered policy by the Chinese. We're simply going to undercut your domestic manufacturers around the world, kill those manufacturers, grab the market share. It's illegal under international trade, and we ought not to put up for it. So that's why I think I welcome President Trump's tough-minded attitude when it comes to trade with China. I don't welcome him doing it with India or Japan or South Korea, but certainly with China, I do. And I hope he's successful in pushing back against this. This is called overcapacity,
Yeah.
this just general problem. So I think that is the number one problem we're engaged in. And very quickly on the second point that I would make an answer to your question is the Chinese have, under Belt and Road, Some estimates are that they have put out either grants or loans, a total of about $1 trillion since 2012, in grants or loans to developing economies in Southeast Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America. And they have, there's been a lot of criticism of Belt and Road, as there should be, because of the indebtedness that it has engendered in countries like Zambia and Sri Lanka, to give you two examples. But it's given China a lot of influence. And I saw that when we tried to, in the UN Human Rights Council, we tried to penalize China for its treatment of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang province. And we lost in 2 consecutive years votes at the UN Human Rights Council because a lot of those countries in the global south lined up to support China, not the United States and the Netherlands and Japan. And that was a bitter, bitter experience for us. I'll give you one final example. As I was flying in to meet President Biden and his team for President Biden's last meeting with Xi Jinping at the Lima summit after our election, just last November, in Peru. And the New York Times ran a story that day as I was flying in saying that with a color-coded map, in 2002, the United States was the lead trade partner of every country in South America. And in 2024, this is last November, China was the leading trade partner of every country in South America, I think, except for Colombia, where the United States had a narrow lead. So what does that tell you? We can criticize Belt and Road. It should be criticized in many respects, but it's been successful in garnering much greater economic and political influence than we have in many of these critical parts of the world, where countries like Nigeria, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa are, they're increasing their power in the world, and China has influence in these countries that we don't. That's something that we need to reflect on. How do we compete with China in this landscape? And right now, we're not mounting a lot of competition to avoid this persisting for the next 10 to 20 years.
So when we look at China's leadership,
Not a
President,
lot of happy news here, Andre,
yeah,
as
not
we go
not
through
not not
these
a lot
issues
of
one by
happy
one.
news. Not a lot of
This is a
happy news.
tough, complicated relationship.
No, absolutely. And when you talk about dumping, for example, I mean, my uncle from Sri Lanka was just talking the other week about his BYD car, how cheap it was, and so on, right? And China's dumping these EVs all throughout, all these various countries and entities. I mean,
Right.
the EU was putting a lot of tariffs on these EVs because, I mean, really low input costs, no worker rights, labor is super cheap. So, I mean, a $13,000 BYD is certainly going to
And the
beat out.
product is good, most people say.
Yeah, it's the product's good. My uncle was saying it was like a Tesla, right? And like if a Tesla's $35,000, US dollars, and a BYD is 13,000, then it's a no-brainer. So if you're an auto worker in Michigan, the Detroit area, you're going to be really worried about, the idea that BYDs may be able to make it into America because they'll put you out of business.
Well, President Biden put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs just for that reason, that this would be unfair competition. A BYD actually has a series of models. They have some models that cost as much as the Tesla, but you're right, they have these cheaper models that a lot of people are buying up in countries where the Chinese EV manufacturers have access. But the doors are closing in Europe. Europe's put tariffs on Chinese EVs. The US, 100% tariffs. So as President Trump thinks about this and gets to hopefully an end game on trade, I would not expect the United States to compromise on some of those tariffs, the sectoral tariffs on
Mm.
steel and robotics and EVs, and we shouldn't. We've got to keep these manufactured products that are being dumped on foreign markets out of our market so that we can develop our own market and our own technology base with electric vehicles.
And strengthen our industry and protect our workers.
Exactly right. And I'm sorry that our administration has turned against wind and solar power. I live in Massachusetts, and on our coastline, we have new wind farms that are making, real progress in linking homes up and reducing energy bills and saving energy. And yet the administration wants to kill this nascent wind as well as the solar industry in the United States. I think it's an own goal. It's just hurting us in our
Yeah.
worldwide competition with the Chinese.
Well, we'll have to wait for the next administration to come in to see if there's any change on that front. But I mean, when we look at Chinese leadership today, I mean, President Xi Jinping, I mean, he's probably the most prominent Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping. I mean, the power is so centralized, it is so personalized under Xi right now. I mean, how did that impact how US diplomats engaged with China versus how they might have engaged under President Hu Jintao, for example, and some of his predecessors?
Well, President Xi Jinping is very powerful. He has strengthened the power of the Communist Party relative to the government structures, civil government structures in China. He has set out a very ambitious agenda for China in his theory of a Chinese dream. He has been more aggressive, certainly, than President Hu Jintao or President Jiang Zemin, for instance, or even President Deng Xiaoping, he was never president of China, but as leader of China said, China at that time in the 80s and 90s should bide its time and hide its light. It's a different time in Chinese history. They consider themselves under President Xi to be a peer power of the United States. They are pushing out. They are pushing against us and our allies, as we talked about before. And so he's a very different Chinese leader in that sense. The key thing in working with the Chinese is, of course, to get decisions to him, because often in this one man rule or this Communist Party rule, decisions cannot be made by the cabinet, by cabinet secretaries in China. Many of them have to go to President Xi. And so that's why symmetry is so important. President Biden had 3 summit meetings with President Xi in 2022, 23, and 24. And we had to make sure that some of these really difficult issues got to both of them because that's the only way they could be decided. So, you adjust and you recognize the reality of where power is in a society as a diplomat, and you try to steer things in that direction.
So, my last question, what are you most concerned about or fearful about when it comes to US China relations?
It's a very good question, and it requires a longer answer than I should give, so I'll try to be brief. I'm concerned that we've underestimated Chinese power in the world and China's thirst for power in the world, its ambitions. I think that most people in our Congress, there's really a bipartisan consensus. China's our strongest competitor. But based on my own experience, I traveled to 26 of the 34 Chinese provinces and administrative regions. I worked closely with, the government ministries. I went into the factories. I went into the high tech industry and in Sichuan province, in Guangdong province. I've seen how capable the Chinese are. They are a real competitor for the United States, so we need to raise our game. I thought it was a great mistake to put Voice of America and Radio Free Asia out of business. That was our ability to get free information into the Chinese bloodstream, and now it's gone. It was a major mistake. I thought it was a critical mistake to dismantle USAID. Not a perfect institution, but a very important institution. And now we can't compete in the global South. And the Chinese are actually following in behind us and replacing us as a voice in many of these societies. And so I do think that we need to step up to this challenge, compete with China, and really give it our best. And in those 2 areas, we're not competing effectively. And even in an environment, Andre, which we should dominate, how do you communicate, whether it's with the rest of the world, whether it's on social media or through television or through the message, the power of the message? CGTN and CCTV, the two of the Chinese networks globally, are much more powerful and omnipresent than anything that we have to offer. And so we need a whole of government approach. There are lessons that we can live in a positive sense from what went right during the old Cold War battle against Mao, against Stalin, where the United States outpointed them. And so I really think we need a much greater effort to compete with China, but then also to acknowledge, just to wrap this up, that in the nuclear weapons world, in the AI world, in the cyber world, we've got to be very careful to drive down the probability that we might end up in a conflict with China. It would be absolutely catastrophic for the world and, of course, for our two countries. So that makes this relationship so difficult to manage.
Mhm.
That our strongest competitor is also a country with which we have to work on some of these issues and we have to keep the peace. We've got to do all three of those things and do them well. And the last thing I'll tell you is that that's why we need experienced diplomats, diplomats who are non-political and bipartisan, career people who understand China, who speak the language, who understand the culture, and the fact that the State Department has fired 3,000 career professionals in a very small department. And I think it's going to set us back for years to come. So I'm very opposed to politicizing the State Department, but also firing 3,000 people. It makes no sense for our country. We have to have all hands on deck. For the most difficult thing we're going to do for the next 20 or 30 years, compete with China and yet live with China in the world. So I haven't given much hope. And I'm sorry for those people who are watching this or listening to this. It's a real downer, but you have to be honest. These are the stakes. And I'd end this on maybe a more positive note. The United States is fully capable of meeting this challenge. If we put all hands on deck, we honor our career military, intelligence community, State Department professionals more than we are now, and rely on our allies to work alongside us by treating them respectfully, I think we can outpoint the Chinese and deter them. But only if we do those things, and I'm confident that we can do it, and I hope we will do that and adopt that policy that President Biden led so well over his time in office. So thank you, Andre.
Ambassador Burns, thank you so much. I mean, certainly our country can meet these challenges. It's just a matter of whether or not we want to shoot ourselves in the foot with a shotgun. So thank you so much. I think, so much of what you said can be interpreted as a downer, but I mean, there's so much keen insight. You talked about the team that backed you up for about 3 years in Beijing. There are so many people who are willing to meet the challenge. It's just when they'll get the opportunity to.
Thank you, Andre. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.